U vremenu koje se mijenja brže nego što ga možemo razumjeti i raspada se na strahove, ratove, granice i podjele, književnost je jedno od rijetkih mjesta u kojem možemo usporiti, nešto osjetiti, nešto razumjeti, spoznati svijet i sebe. Jedna od najutjecajnijih suvremenih svjetskih književnica, britansko-turska autorica Elif Shafak, u svojim djelima daje glas onima koje društvo zaboravlja. Žene na rubu tišine, ljudi izbrisani u genocidu, oni koji žive između jezika i domova, nalaze mjesto u njezinim djelima. Njezina književnost nastaje na rubovima, ondje od čega najčešće okrećemo pogled i vraća nam ljudsko lice. Elif Shafak piše o onome što se inače skriva i u svijetu u kojem dijelimo sve na nas i na njih, ona zna ono što je najvažnije, empatija, emocija danas gotovo subverzivna. Njezine su knjige prevedene na gotovo 60 jezika, a čitaju se diljem svijeta kao romani, ali i kao moralni kompasi. Zbog njih je bila nagrađivana, ali i suđena. Jer književnost koja dira u zaborav, u tabu i u kolektivne mitove uvijek je opasna. Zbog romana Kopile Istanbula, u kojem se bavila armenskim genocidom, bila je suđena, a na sudu morala je braniti fikcionalne likove. Došli smo u London razgovarati s njom kako su priče važne, zašto je roman prostor slobode i zbog čega može ono što politika ne može. Idemo upoznati Elif Shafak. It's really a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. Everyone I mentioned this interview to was really thrilled, and people usually say I lost myself in a book. But I think it's better to say I found myself in a book, and many readers from Croatia and from my part of Europe, so to say, found themselves in your books.
You know, these words are really very precious for me. Writing novels is a very lonely journey.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the loneliest forms of art. You never know when you're writing if the story you're working on is going to mean anything to anyone, but you trust it. You trust the story and you let it into this river of time. And for me to learn that there are readers, in Croatia, as you said, in your part of Europe, which is so crucial, also historically and today so important, and also close to my heart.
Yeah.
To learn that I have readers from all age groups, from all backgrounds, and I've known this for some time because they sent me, messages, emails. But to hear this once again from you is really very, very precious for me. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah, thank you. Although I have a problem, I have too many questions for you. But it's good to have questions.
It's very good to have questions, absolutely.
Maybe better than the answers.
I agree, People who are very sure of their answers usually close the door on thinking, progress. But when we have questions and when we care about questions, I think it's very nourishing intellectually and spiritually. So let's start with questions. I'm looking forward.
So we are here in London. You're living for quite a long time here.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful city full of opportunities. And sometimes in such a places of almost a decadent comfort, I'm thinking about the world in a whole. And we know that the world outside is rapidly changing, wars, migrations, climate crisis. And sometimes in such a situations, I wonder, feeling a bit like Don Quixote, what would happen if those people who have the keys of our destiny in their hands, who rule our world, had truly read and understood perhaps Tolstoy's War and Peace, the Diary of Anne Frank, The Faithlessness from Imre Kertész, or Sadako Wants to Live, perhaps those one who are building new atomic bombs right now. What do you think, would the world be a different place?
What a thoughtful and great question. Like you, I believe if only the people who had so much power and authority today read books, you know, if only they read not only particular type of books, but across the board, fiction and non-fiction. If only politicians, rulers read poetry, novels. Why do I say this? Because I think fiction is very interested in truth. It's very unfortunate that in the English language we use the word fiction as if it were the opposite of fact. And sometimes people think that, well, if you want to escape the real world, you should go into the world of, you know, imagination. Mm-hmm. I don't think like that. I think fiction is very, very interested in our world. Whatever is the subject of life is the subject of literature. So inside a novel there is politics, there is history, there is psychology, there is technology, there is neuroscience. There is so much that is already in our world and in our lives. But perhaps more importantly, there is emotional intelligence. And I do not know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions. It doesn't matter what we do in life. We could be dentists, we could be designers, bakers, politicians. We all need to understand this age of angst. We all need to connect with our own emotions. When we read a novel for a few hours, for a few days, we leave our comfort zones, we leave our atomized spaces, and we journey into the life of another human being. That is a very humbling exercise for the soul, you know, and we have to make those journeys. When we come back after reading a novel, I think something has changed in us, something has shifted. I have a lot of love and respect for the word empathy.
Empathy, yes.
Right? For me, empathy is not sympathy. It's definitely not pity. It doesn't mean somebody is above.
So to say.
There is compassion, as you said. I also like the Germanic root of the word, you know, einfühlen, in which you journey
like you're
into
entering.
You're entering into a feeling, right? That's an incredible thing that we have forgotten in this age of hyper-information and extreme tribalism and division. So I wish more politicians would be reading fiction. Yeah,
but empathy is now almost a subversive act, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah, I think empathy...
It became so radical.
Absolutely, I'm with you. I think empathy is so radical now. Yeah. It's so almost revolutionary. It's so subversive because you're literally swimming against the current.
Yeah.
Because the current of the time is pushes us into boxes and tells us that we can only belong or we can only be part of one box in which we must stay once and for all. But when we look at human beings as writers, what we see is nuances. What we see is pluralism, multiplicity. Every human being is so complex. You know, so in Storyland, there are no boxes. There is no us versus them. There is no other. When you read a story about someone who might seem to be very different, and then you realize how much you're similar, the other becomes your brother. The other becomes your sister. You know, I and the other unite. So there's oneness in literature. It's almost like a mystical experience. But we never talk about this enough in today's world.
Yeah. Recently you published an article, I think it was in The Guardian, about why we still need novels, why we still need longer forms. Yeah. And you said about 40% of Britons have not read a single book in the last year. You mentioned even Philip Roth's words that literary era has come to an end. But you concluded something more optimistically, I would say. The more chaotic our times are, the deeper our need to slow down and to read fiction.
Yes, so two interesting, almost two contrasting things are happening at the same time. Of course, on the one hand, we live in an age of hyper-information, shortening attention spans, and unfortunately, information has become easy, or it looks like it's easy, so that we forgot to put effort into knowledge. We forgot to say, I don't know. It's an age in which everything is consumed very fast. So hyperinformation, fast consumption, instant gratification. And understandably, the number of people who are reading books is in decline. And this is very, very worrisome. However, there's another side, and that is interesting. Almost in opposition, among those who read, there's a very interesting shift. Now, those of us like me who are old enough, we will remember that 1980s, 1990s, early noughties, 2010s, there were so many predictions that the novel was dead.
Yeah.
Right? Article after article was published saying from now on nobody's going to read novels. But what is happening is actually the opposite.
It's the reaction.
The reaction. Because the faster this world spins, the more confusing it becomes, the more maybe anxious we feel. This is the age of angst. We are all so anxious. Then the deeper our need to slow down, to connect with our fellow human beings, and the deeper our need for the ancient art of storytelling. Why do I say ancient? Because we're talking about an art form which is really timeless, placeless. It doesn't belong to a single religion, region, class, ethnicity. It belongs to all humanity. And I am seeing, and I do lots of events, I am seeing more and more young people coming to literary events. I am seeing more and more young male readers. These are things that make me happy. The number of book clubs, the number of people sharing novels. When we look at the industry, it hasn't fallen, the sales figures for novels. So there is a quiet revolution taking place, even in this age of hyperinformation and fast consumption.
Recently, you've been elected the new president of the Royal Society of Literature. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, what do you hope to do in this role?
Well, this is an incredibly important organization, institution that is more than 200 years old.
Yeah.
So it has so much history, it has so much tradition. And under its umbrella, there are more than 700 members, including honorary members. And I think, for me, when we talk about fellowship, I want to focus on that word. I want to focus on both meanings of that word. Not only fellowship as in being a member of an old and important organization, that's one of the meanings, but there's a second meaning of the word, fellowship as in solidarity, as in sisterhood, as in literary camaraderie, as in companionship. That meaning is very important for me, because we live in an age in which there are so many challenges against writers, poets, librarians, against literacy, literature, freedom of imagination, the art of storytelling. So I want to see this as almost like a sanctuary, open to everyone, welcoming, inclusive, egalitarian, and supportive. To me, that second meaning of the word fellowship is very, very important.
Great. In the heart of your literary mission, so to say, is to speak, to write about those who are forgotten. And you say that literature comes from an inner wound. So how come, is it hard to tell stories about such a painful subject?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. As you know, I come from Turkey, which is a country that has a very old history or rich history, but that doesn't mean, that doesn't translate into strong memory. So if anything, in Turkey it's quite the opposite. We are a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And when you have void, empty spaces like that, it's very easy to fill that void with ultra-nationalistic, imperial nostalgia that talks about, we were always a great empire. Wherever we went, we brought justice and civilization. So that's the rhetoric, right? But then as a writer, you ask questions. I want to know, okay, do you tell me this is the story of the empire, but I'm curious about the stories of women. What was the empire like for women? But women who had no access to power or authority, For instance, a peasant woman in the Balkans, in Anatolia, a prostitute in Istanbul, a concubine in the, let's say, Sultan's harem who was not the Sultan's favorite. Where are their stories? And there's a big silence. Or what was the Ottoman Empire like for minorities? You know, if you were a member of the Christian minority, or if you happen to be an Armenian silversmith, a Jewish miller, an Arab peasant, a Kurdish farmer, a Greek sailor, what was life like, you know? What was life like for those families whose sons were taken into the janissaries, and so on? You ask these questions, and then there are big, big pockets of silence.
Silence, yeah.
So I think when you are a storyteller from such a complicated background, you have to become interested not only in stories, but also in silences. So for me, it has always been important in my work to pay attention to the periphery, the silenced, the forgotten, the suppressed, and I try to bring that periphery to the center, give it a little bit more voice. Some of these stories are, of course, very, very painful, but there are also amazing stories of hope, resilience. At the end of the day, you know, my work is full of imagination, but I also do a lot of research into history, you know, philosophy. I love interdisciplinary thinking. I love novels of ideas that try to connect the dots.
We have to admit that all around the world nowadays the misogyny is on the rise. How could you comment this situation? What frightens you the most, and what gives you hope?
I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, again in late 1990s, early 2000s, there was so much optimism back then in the world. And I think back then the biggest optimists were the tech optimists, right? They would tell us that if you spread digital technologies, information was going to be everywhere, everyone was going to become informed citizens, and from now on it was the triumph of liberal democracy. History could go only in one direction, there would be no more authoritarianism. That was the prediction back then. And again in those days, I remember some scholars also telling me that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because I was Turkish. You know, in Turkey you needed feminism, but you didn't need it in America, you didn't need it in Canada or Scandinavian countries. That was the perception back then. And I think fast forward, now we know that this dualistic interpretation of the world was wrong. You know, there is no such thing as some countries being solid and other countries being liquid. In fact, we're all living in liquid times, which means, of course, there are differences. I'm not, you know, claiming there are no differences between countries, but what I am saying is what is happening in one country can happen elsewhere. So right now, as we're talking in America, we are seeing librarians going through an incredibly difficult time because of book bans and book removals. Equally, we are seeing across the world, in country after country, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and so on, being questioned, attacked, and women being told that our primary role in life is as mothers, as homemakers, you know. There's nothing wrong with women choosing to become homemakers,
yes, of course,
but it has to be our choice, not imposed on us from above. So all I'm saying is, when and if democracies crumble, because democracy is very fragile, it's much more fragile than people thought in early 2000s. And when and if democracies crumble, the very first rights that will be taken away will be women's rights. So we women have to be more passionate defenders of democracy, and we have to also develop bonds of solidarity and sisterhood. We need to support each other. I'm a big, big believer in that.
Sisterhood is a nice word.
It's a very
like
nice
it,
word. Yeah.
But it's very dangerous to write about such a painful stories, forgotten people and teams. So you wrote Bastard of Istanbul, and that book was even put on the trial. And it was very horrible time for you. You were frightened. Your pictures were burned on the street in Turkey, and you had to have bodyguard, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the prosecutor asked for 3 years in prison, isn't it? Yeah. And your lawyer had to defend fictional characters.
Yeah.
But how did you feel then? And what do you think, was it worth it?
Well, it was a very unsettling time for me.
Yeah.
Also, it was quite surprising, shocking, maybe I should use that word, because I was not expecting it at all.
Yeah.
In the Turkish constitution, we have an article that protects Turkishness, but nobody quite knows what that means, you know? It protects Turkishness against insults, that's the definition. And because it's so vague, it is open to interpretation and misinterpretation. And this article had been used against historians and journalists before, but never ever before against a fiction writer, against a novelist. So that was completely unexpected. We're talking about right now about the novel The Bastard of Istanbul, which tells the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family through the eyes of women, generations of women, great-grandmothers, grandmothers, daughters, and so on.
And you addressed the Armenian genocide.
I did. I did address the Armenian genocide, which is one of the biggest taboos in Turkey, if not the biggest still to this day. And when the book came out, it was a very maybe interesting experience, or I felt almost torn, because on the one hand, from readers, I received a lot of love and support, but immediately, as soon as it was published, I also received a lot of hatred and hate speech, verbal attacks from ultranationalist groups who called me a traitor, a betrayer, as if I have betrayed my country, and I have sided with the enemy in their eyes. So I was put on trial, and it was very, honestly, very Kafkaesque. It was very surreal, because the words of fictional characters were used as evidence in the courtroom. And as you mentioned, there were groups on the streets spitting at my pictures, burning EU flags, and so on. So that lasted for a year. I was pregnant at the time, and that's why it was emotionally also challenging for me. Later on, 2 other novels of mine were again investigated by a prosecutor, this time for the crime of obscenity, quote unquote, because I write about issues like sexual violence, violence against women, but also child brides, which in my opinion means child abuse. And we have an increasing number of child brides in Turkey. We need to address this, you know. So the reason why I'm mentioning is because whether you write about history, politics, sexuality, gender, domestic life, anything you write about can offend the authorities or can offend some groups in the society, and you can find yourself as a writer in trouble as a result of that. You can be sued, investigated, prosecuted, you know, exiled, imprisoned, and so on. So it is not a very supportive environment for the art of literature, but at the same time, it's a country of enormous complexity and beauty.
Yes, of course.
So you will also find lots of readers who passionately read books, and then they share books.
And who appreciate such a book.
Who appreciate, you know, when I do book signings, honestly, they bring me books that have been underlined by different colored pens, because on average, 5 to 6 people have read the same book. So in Turkey, a book is not a personal item. If you enjoy a book, you don't put it back on the
you
bookshelf.
borrow it,
You share it with your friends, with your neighbors. And in that sense, word of mouth, sharing stories is incredibly beautiful. And I want to mention that side as well. So it's a very divided experience when you're a Turkish writer. You get a lot of difficulty, but you get a lot of love too.
What's the greatest compliment you ever got from your readers?
You know, for me, I think the biggest reward or gift, maybe I should say, is when readers from a completely different part of the world or maybe cultural background or family story, comes and says or sends me a letter and says, you know, I've read your novel and it meant so much to me, it touched my heart. These are incredibly precious words for me to hear because I believe in those connections. I genuinely believe that literature is a bridge that brings us together. Stories bring us together, but silences keep us apart. So what literature does is it really builds bridges through words, through stories, through empathy, and those bridges transcend borders, transcend boxes, even in an age as divisive and fractured as this one. So those are the words that I find very precious.
Your books are very emotional, but nowadays many intellectuals underestimate the power of emotions.
Yeah.
So what would happen if we appreciate emotions as much as ideas or perhaps as a form of knowledge?
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful question. It's such an irony, isn't it? On the one hand, we live in an age in which emotions guide and misguide sometimes everything almost. Right? There's so much anger right now, so much anxiety, bitterness, frustration, and so on. And at the same time, we don't talk about emotions enough.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, emotions are not a sign of weakness.
No, not at all.
I like it actually when a politician can show emotions. Yeah. I think only someone who's strong enough to show their emotions can connect with other people at a almost, you know, spiritual level, not only cerebral, but from the heart. I am not denying, of course, as a novelist, that the intellect is very important for us. Course, we do a lot of research. I love intellectual productivity, but what I'm trying to say is the heart is always bigger than the mind. The mind has its own restrictions, the mind has its own worries and boxes, but the heart is really so vast and capable of connecting on so many levels. I'd rather see emotions as a source of raw energy. So the question is not whether are you anxious, are you depressed, are you frustrated, because we all are.
Yeah.
Some people hide it, some people don't hide it. That's the only difference. But the question for me is, what do you do with your anxiety? What do you do with your depression? I think that is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Can we see these as sources of energy and try to use them for a much more positive and constructive end? There's a beautiful essay by Toni Morrison in which she says, you know, sometimes I feel so angry, understandably, you know, there's so much happening, of course we feel angry. But the next line in the essay is so simple and so powerful. She says, sometimes I feel so angry and then I sit down at my desk and I write. I love it because she takes her anger and turns it into literature. Another person takes their anxiety and turns it into art. Another person takes their depression and turns it into maybe climate activism. You know, these are precious because we don't deny our emotions, but we channel it into something more positive, not only for ourselves, but also for our communities and for humanity. At the end of the day, there's only one emotion that I find very, very scary, and that is apathy. That is the lack of all emotions, and that is numbness. You know, the moment we become indifferent, the moment we say, I don't care, you know, that is a very dangerous threshold when we are desensitized to such an extent that we stop caring about what's happening in the world, either in another country or next door to our neighbor, to our neighbor's child. You know, the moment we stop connecting and caring, I think that will be a much, much darker and more difficult world to live in.
You wrote also a book, 40 Rules of Love, such a beautiful work. What kind of love do you think we need most today?
I think when we use the word love in the English language in particular, it's only one word, isn't it?
Yeah.
We try to lump together so many emotions under one concept The ancient Greeks, of course, they were wiser than us. They had at least 6, 8 different words to describe love. And we forgot those nuances. I mean, eros was very different than agape, for instance. In Arabic, you can find over 10 different words to describe love. In Turkish, we have only 2. But my point is, we need to think of it in a much more nuanced way. I think love and freedom always go hand in hand. Love is not ownership. It is not possessive. So we use words like my wife, my husband, my fiancé, and there's a lot of emphasis there on the first word, my. But I think there's no ownership in love. I think a true love is fluid, flowing. It means it's open to change. You know, you allow the other person to change you, and you change them. It's mutual. There's a beautiful description of Shams and Rumi, which I was inspired by when I was writing the 40 Rules of Love, because in the archives, Rumi is described as water, and Shams is described as fire. You know, fire and water are not supposed to love each other, but they did love each other, and they changed each other. That's why in the novel there's a line, it says, if we are the same person before and after we loved, it means we haven't loved enough. You know, with love comes beautiful, organic change.
Great thought. I liked one interview. You said that you like the most sitting in your room, to close the door, and to read aloud poetry and prose to your furniture.
Yes.
And you mentioned that the dimmable lamp in the corner likes Thomas Stearns Eliot, and the sofa prefers Virginia Woolf.
True. True. I love reading out loud, because as you can hear, of course, in my accent, I am not a native speaker in English. I'm an immigrant, a double immigrant, in the sense that I'm an immigrant both in the UK
and
but
in
also,
the language also.
But in the language I'm writing in, so in the English language also I'm an immigrant. And that means, of course, as every immigrant knows this, there's a gap between the mind and the tongue. You know, the mind always runs faster, and the tongue is clumsy, awkward.
I know that.
You know that, I know that. We both understand each other, because we always want to say more as immigrants, in a much more nuanced way. We want to crack better jokes, and we can't quite get it in the way we want. And that gap is very, very frustrating. But I think it's also inspiring, because it means we don't take words for granted.
Yeah, of course.
Right? We pay attention to those words that cannot be translated easily from one language to the other. So we have a very different relationship with language. And I don't want us to be intimidated by that, but hopefully inspired by that. Now, reading out loud is a very good thing, because it helps us to hear the melody, the cadence, the rhythm of the language. Poetry is always a challenge for an immigrant, but when I read it to furniture around me, I feel like they love it. You know, they enjoy, I enjoy. So I want to, keep reading out loud.
Nature is also important in your books, and I have one quote which is very, very beautiful. It says, what we shed as tears is the same water you find in the Mississippi, the Ganges, the Thames, and the Euphrates. You wrote that. And water is a powerful symbol in your work. It flows through our sentences, so to say. So what does water know about us, what we forgot?
Yeah, beautiful question. I mean, we look at a glass of water and we take it for granted.
Yeah.
But actually, the moment we are living in, I genuinely believe it's the story of water. Both the abundance of water, like flash floods, which sadly we will see more and more of, but also the scarcity of water. Because the irony is, in the midst of too much water, it feels like, because sea levels are rising with climate crisis, we are seeing more heavy rainfall, we are seeing more flash floods. In the midst of all that, the truth is, we don't have enough water to drink as humanity. So for those of us coming from the Middle East, This is not a hypothetical scenario, you know. It is an acute reality. It is happening right now.
Yeah.
Because of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, 7 of them are in the Middle East and in North Africa, which means our rivers are dying, and it is very visible. This has massive consequences for everyone. It will affect everything. We will see more political violence, extremism, hardships if there's no water. But it also affects disproportionately women, children, and the poor. Women usually are water carriers. You know, when there's no drinkable water in a village, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence. So in our minds, we put these things in separate boxes. We say, okay, this is the box for climate crisis, this is the box for water scarcity, another box for women's rights, another box for racial inequality. But in life, there are no boxes. Everything is connected. And that is what water tells us. Even a single drop of water tells us that as humanity, we haven't discovered new sources of water. Imagine, throughout millennia, we have been using the same water over and over. So this is the same water that maybe 10 years ago, 50 years ago, you know, whatever, was flowing in a river in a completely different part of the world. It's the same water that one of us might have shed as tears. The water in the Euphrates or the Mississippi, they're not separate bodies of water, and everything is connected in life. I think water reminds us that we should not take even a single drop of water for granted, and we need to pay more attention to those things that might seem small and insignificant. Nothing is small, nothing is insignificant.
Yeah. In your childhood, you were, so to say, shaped by migrations. You lived or born in Strasbourg and lived in Turkey, America. And I have read that your grandma influenced you a lot. What did she learn you?
Yes, my maternal grandmother played a big role in my life. So I was born in France, in Strasbourg, but my parents got separated after a while, so I did not live in France. My father stayed in France. He married again, and he had a French family. And then my mother, in the meantime, brought me to Turkey. So we came to my maternal grandmother's house in Ankara. This is a very middle class, very conservative, very patriarchal and inward-looking neighborhood where I really felt we didn't quite fit in because my mom was a young divorcee. Everywhere around, you know, it was very patriarchal families. At the time, young women who are divorced would be immediately married off to someone older so that an old man could take care of her and the child. That was the pattern. And it was my maternal grandmother who intervened, and she said, no, my daughter should go back to university. Because my mother had made a mistake. She had thought that love was enough. When she got married, she had dropped out of university. She was very young. As a result, she had no diploma, no career, no money, nothing to support her. So my grandmother said, I'll take care of my granddaughter until the day her mother is ready.
A wise woman.
Yeah, it was a very unusual thing to do. So off my mother went to university. I was with grandma all the time. And my grandmother was not a very well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school for being a girl in Turkey at the time. And she wholeheartedly believed in women's education. So what she did is she broke the chain. You know, if we can break the chain, then we can generate real difference. Instead of saying, okay, this is what happened to me, so I should do the same, you know, she said, no, my daughter should have a better life than I had. And that changed my mother's life. So she graduated with a very high average, and then she entered the foreign ministry, and then I had a very good education thanks to that, but it was all thanks to my grandma. And she showed me, grandma was a very wise woman, she showed me that you might not have a fancy diploma on the wall, but you can still be a wise human being. Or you can graduate from a very posh school, from a very well-known, institution or university, but you can still be an ignorant person in life. So there are different paths to knowledge, and she helped me to connect with oral culture and the world of oral storytelling, which I've always been interested in.
I'm always trying to find the answer on the name of our show, my program, which is what is classic.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to find the answer on what makes a book a classic. So help me find it, please.
Well, it's a beautiful question. I've never believed in that distinction between highbrow literature, lowbrow literature. I don't really approach books like that. Who even makes those distinctions? I think for me the main thing is the curiosity of the mind. Let's keep the curiosity of the mind alive. Let's be intellectual nomads. I love eclectic reading lists, Let's read across the board. So let's read philosophy, political philosophy. It's really very important. Equally, let's read cookbooks. Cookbooks are wonderful. They tell us so much about a culture, a region. Let's read graphic novels.
Poetry.
Poetry,
Above
absolutely,
yeah.
Definitely. Anything and everything that speaks to us, in that moment in time is the right book for us. But let's not make our reading lists only Eurocentric. Let's not forget that there are different traditions of storytelling across the world. So what troubles me is sometimes when we say classics, we usually talk about a list that is 80% Eurocentric. We need to challenge that.
Yeah.
For me, classics are books that I would love to read again and again.
And again, yeah.
And each time I read, I find something new. It never feels repetitive. That is a classic for me. And it can be any form from anywhere in the world. That's a very personal relationship we build with a beloved book.
Such a beautiful message from the end of our show, or our program. Thank you for the interview.
I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Razmišljajući o riječima Elif Shafak, vraćam se jednoj njezinoj misli u kojoj je sažela smisao književnosti. U svijetu koji nas dijeli, priče nas ponovno spajaju. Možda neko djelo postaje književni klasik u onom trenutku kad ga neki daleki čitatelj u nekoj tamo dalekoj zemlji pročita i pronađe u njemu svoj život i shvati da uopće nismo toliko različiti. Dragi gledatelji, hvala vam što zajedno s nama tražite odgovor na pitanje što je klasik. Doviđenja.